Welcome to our program. Tonight, a Charlie Rose special edition. In the 9th episode of our Brain series, we look at the mentally ill brain.
Emil Kraepelin, in around 1900, revolutionized the field. People had not known whether one was dealing with a number of different illnesses or with one major illness, and he broke this down into two major categories: disorders of mood and disorders of thought. In disorders of mood, he characterized depression and manic depressive illness. In disorders of thought, he characterized schizophrenia, which he called dementia praecox, dementia at early phase of life. And as you outlined, we have a very good understanding from his descriptions and from later descriptive work of the nature of these diseases.
The 9th episode of the Charlie Rose Brain series, underwritten by the Simons Foundation, coming up. The Charlie Rose Brain series is about the most exciting scientific journey of our time, understanding the brain. The series is made possible by a grant from the Simons Foundation. Their mission is to advance the frontiers of research in the basic sciences and mathematics.
From our studios in New York, this is a special edition of Charlie Rose.
Tonight we continue our exploration of the wonders of neuroscience. Our subject this evening is mental illness. When our mental processes go awry, the results can be devastating. Diseases such as depression, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia are some of the toughest known to humankind. They interfere with a patient's thoughts, motivations, and even one's sense of self. Society has stigmatized mental illness for thousands of years. Only recently have we come to think of mental disorders as serious medical conditions. This breakthrough in understanding has improved the lives of those stricken and opened the door for important research. With proper care, many of the treated are able to lead productive and fulfilling lives. Tonight, we'll meet two remarkable women who have risen to the top of their fields despite suffering from mental illness. Kay Redfield Jamison is a world-renowned authority on bipolar disorder, a disease she has struggled with throughout her adulthood. She is a professor at Johns Hopkins University and co-director of Johns Hopkins Mood Disorders Center. Ellen Sachs was diagnosed with schizophrenia as a young woman. After keeping the disease private for most of her adult life, she publicly revealed her illness in 2007. She is a professor at the University of Southern California Gould School of Law and founder of the Sachs Institute of Mental Health Law, Policy, and Ethics at USC. Also joining me are three scientists who have performed cutting-edge research into the biology of mental illness. Jeffrey Lieberman, he studies the neurobiology of schizophrenia and related psychotic disorders. He is a professor at Columbia University and director of the New York State Psychiatric Institute. Stephen Warren, his research helped isolate the gene responsible for Fragile X syndrome. He is now studying the genetic basis of the major psychiatric disorders. Helen Mayberg, her research uses scanning technology to isolate the brain regions involved in clinical depression. She has performed studies that illustrate the positive effects of deep brain stimulation on depressed patients. And once again, my co-host is Dr. Eric Kandel. As you know, he is a Nobel laureate, a professor at Columbia University, and a Howard Hughes medical investigator. So I am pleased to sort of begin this conversation with this sense that, for reasons you will tell us, this is a different episode of our series.
Here we're speaking about major psychiatric disorders. As you outlined, we're going to discuss depression, manic depressive disorder, also called bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. And we're going to try to understand what is the biological nature of these disorders and what can we do about them. These are, as you indicated, devastating disorders. They affect the way people think, the way people feel, they affect their motivation. Moreover, one of the tragic aspects of these disorders is that they affect people early in their lives, just as they're beginning to reach the peak of their productivity, their peak of ability to enjoy themselves. Schizophrenia typically begins in college or in the early 20s. Although there are vicissitudes in these diseases, often they remain with people for the rest of their life. Therefore, they're an extremely heavy burden for the patient and for society as large. Fortunately, as you've indicated, these diseases are treatable. and we now have some clues as to what optimizes treatment. Early intervention and combination of psychotherapy and drug therapy.
Once again, you have a book here, which is important because we constantly look ahead, but at the same time we see the foundations for the kind of studies we make.
You're absolutely right. This is an extremely important guide. The whole history of psychiatry, which is a culmination in Emil Kraepelin, is interesting. We've known about these illnesses since Hippocrates, the great Greek physician in the 5th century, not only spoke about depression and manic depressive psychosis, but specifically indicated that these are medical illnesses. But this basic idea was lost on European medicine for the longest period of time. During the Middle Ages and even later in the Renaissance period, these were thought as demonic disorders, people possessed by the devil or moral degeneracies. And people with mental disorders were put away in insane asylums, usually far removed from the center of town, and often they were kept in chains so they don't move around. Fortunately, this situation was reversed in about 1800. The Paris School of Medicine began to really express a very modern view of medical science, and Philippe Pinel, a great French psychiatrist, realized that psychiatric disorders, as Hippocrates has said, are medical illnesses, and he began to institute humane treatment, a beginning of psychotherapy with mental patients. But from 1800 to about 1900, no progress was made in understanding psychiatric disorders. One couldn't localize them to specific regions of the brain, so one didn't know, is there one mental illness or are there many? And that's when our mutual hero, Emil Kraepelin, came on the scene. In his textbooks, which began to emerge around 1902 and continued until he died until 1926, he outlines, for example, in this book, in his first 3 chapters, he defines the fact that mental illnesses are not unitary. They affect 2 different processes. They affect mood, emotion on the one hand, and they affect thinking on the other. And he defines the disorders that affect mood, depression, and manic depressive disorder, and he defined the disorders of thinking as schizophrenia. He called it dementia praecox. He thought it was a deterioration of cognitive process in the brain early in life, praecox. And as you outlined, we have some insight into the nature of these diseases. We know that depression is an illness that involves mood, which is associated with a feeling of worthlessness, an inability to enjoy life, an anhedonia. Nothing, it's all pervasive, nothing gives one pleasure. And there's a feeling of helplessness, of worthlessness, often leading to thoughts of suicide and tragically to suicide attempts themselves. 25% of people that have depression also have manic depressive illness. They have the opposite end of the spectrum. They feel fantastic when the beginning of the disease. They feel better than they've ever felt in their life. But ultimately this leads to grandiosity and frank psychotic episodes. Schizophrenia is a thought disorder that has 3 types of symptoms: positive, negative, and cognitive. The positive symptoms are characteristic of schizophrenia. It's the thought disorder, the hallucinations, the delusions, the acting crazy. The negative symptoms are the sort of the social withdrawal, the lack of motivation, and the cognitive disorders are the difficulty with organizing one's life and the difficulty with a certain kind of memory called working memory, short-term memory. Fortunately, as you indicated, we now see people who have had effective treatment who have very productive lives. And Kate Jameson and Ellen Sachs, despite the fact that they suffered from this disorder much of their life, have rich personal lives, both of them involved in meaningful interpersonal relationships, marriage that is very satisfying to them, and having spectacular academic careers. So there's tremendous hope for the treatment of these
But this
disorders.
is a remarkable thing. Before, we've had some of the leading and cutting-edge scientists involved in neurology and brain science. Here we have not only 2 who are engaged in important research and are leaders in their field, but are also suffering, living with.
This gives such hope to all of us that you can have these devastating diseases, and with appropriate therapy, you can lead a meaningful, rich life.
We'll also find out a bit about the genetics of all of this in terms of of the genetic basis. Are they related biologically?
Well, that is still under active discussion. We're going to hear from Steve Warren. We're going to hear from Jeff Lieberman and Helen Mayberg the biological underpinnings of these diseases. And we know that there are some genes that are different, but it's beginning to emerge that some genes are shared by the two diseases.
All right. This is one of the most interesting things we have done, because in addition to the cutting-edge science, there's also this extraordinary personal testimony. We begin now with our conversation at the table. Tell us about depression and bipolar disorder.
Well, I think one of the things that's really interesting about depression and bipolar disorder is that they really affect not only mood, but they affect energy and sleep as well, and thinking. So that people can, when they're depressed, be very ruminative, be very obsessive, think often of dying. But the mood is not one so much of sadness as it is really of terrible hopelessness and deadness and disinterest in life. And so that all the things that ordinarily are interesting in life to people become irrelevant, basically. And people have trouble sleeping, they have trouble getting to sleep, they have trouble staying asleep. So it's an enormously all-inclusive illness. I mean, people tend to think of depression just as mood, but it's really much, much more than that. And bipolar illness, as Eric said, is the mania is really in many ways the opposite. The people very often have enormously high mood, feel better than they've ever felt in their life. So it's often very difficult to convince people who are manic that they're sick because they feel great. And so if you are talking to an 18-year-old who's staying up all night, full of energy, great ideas, or seemingly great ideas, thinking fast and furious, not very convincing to tell them they're sick. So that's one of the major clinical problems in treating these illnesses, is that they do affect people when they're young and when they're very unlikely to stay in treatment.
Okay, people often speak about psychic pain with depression. You want to speak a little bit about that?
I think that one of the things that's hardest to explain to anyone who's not been depressed is how isolating it is, how painful it is, and that kind of pain just, I'm convinced, cannot be put into words. No matter how many great writers have tried to put these things into words, you simply cannot convey to anyone. When you think about illnesses like terminal cancer, where you would think people would be thinking of dying and committing suicide, the suicide rate is really quite low. The people who really tend to kill themselves are people when they're depressed. It is a level of agony, of arterial agony, that is just astonishing. And as I say, isolation, a sense of what's the point? You know, you don't feel human, you can't think, you can't feel, you can't love.
And some people reach out for suicide.
Absolutely.
When did you know?
Well, I certainly knew. I first sort of flew quite high, as it were, when I was about 17 and a senior in high school. And I felt great. I felt no pain. I had a wonderful time, but it wasn't that different from my usual joie de vivre. So I certainly, other than noticing that my friends were dropping like flies from exhaustion, it didn't seem that bad. What then happened is that I crashed completely, and I had never been depressed a day in my life. I'd never thought about suicide a day in my life or a minute in my life. And all of a sudden, I was incapable of remembering anything, concentrating, reading anything in school, making sense of anything. And I just wanted to die. And I went around trying to figure out how I could die. I thought of death. I felt, and I knew something was very seriously wrong. But at that time, I didn't put in, nobody talked about depression. Nobody talked about bipolar illness or manic depressive illness. The words weren't there. So I didn't know what to do. So I did nothing.
Until?
Well, I kept on that way, up and down for another 10 years. And then I went flamingly psychotic. I was hallucinating and delusional and manic, spending a lot of money that I didn't have, and not wisely. And it was a medical emergency. So I was brought, to care, as it were. And I was very fortunate. I had a terrific psychiatrist who diagnosed what I had absolutely correctly immediately, and I responded very well to lithium.
So I mean, the interesting thing here is you are, in your field, one of those suffering.
Yes. Yes, there's nothing more motivating in life than nearly dying from an illness, which I did because I
But you know a lot about it.
Yeah, because you want to know more. You're a little impatient with the pace of the field, and yeah, it's very motivating.
Yeah. Helen, what do we know about the biology?
Well, our approach to the biology of these major mental illnesses came from chemistry, and chemistry has dominated biological research for over 50 years. The major hypothesis with major depression was the biogenic amine hypothesis, sort of a quart low on serotonin or dopamine or norepinephrine. And that really was driven by observations of drugs that would alter those brain neurotransmitters, and then the recognition that replacing those neurotransmitters, upping the level, seemed to alleviate many symptoms. And that really created the foundation for a hypothesis that these were deficits in these brain neurotransmitters. Problem is just filling up the tank didn't keep you well, and that it really didn't accommodate the course of illness for many people. But it did drive a lot of very, very good neurobiology to understand the important role of serotonin in mood regulation, how it strengthens.
And it was therapeutically very helpful for many people.
And that's the most critical point, is despite the fact that it doesn't explain all of the biology, it has changed the lives of so many patients. And as a neurologist, we're interested in not just what chemicals, but where the chemicals act. And like every other neurological disease, where in this one, in the case of depression, you have a mood problem combined with slowness of movement, motor changes, a change in cognition. People are slow thinking, as well as disorganized, but not like we're going to hear about psychosis, as well as a dysregulation of circadian systems. Your sleep is off, your libido is off, your appetite is off. These are behaviors that we know a lot about where in the brain they live. And with the advent of neuroimaging, it was possible to test those kinds of hypotheses, not so much chemical, but what brain regions are doing what. And with tools like positron emission tomography or PET scanning or functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, we can literally map the brain in action and know exactly our brain areas that we ascribe these behaviors to. Are they overactive, underactive? And we could start to map precisely how the brain circuits that mediate this disease are.
Helen was very interesting because she came into the field of psychiatry being a neurologist. And so she was interested in the kinds of things we've been talking about. Where is it located? And she was the first person to find a biological marker, an area in the brain that was abnormally active in depressed patients. Do you want to discuss that?
Well, again, I mean, we as well as many other investigators using imaging, we're really trying to take groups of people who had classical symptoms, not on medicine, and literally see what was wrong with their brains. Are areas overactive, underactive? Is it one area or another area? And our work started to focus not just on one area, but one area became very much critical. It's an area called the subcallosal cingulate. And what we found was that its activity is overactive in people when they're depressed. And at the same time, there's actually an effect on the frontal lobe, the thinking parts of the brain, that are underactive. So there's almost a tug-of-war, as the patients describe, where there's psychic pain, a very active state of suffering that we think is really driven by this subcallosal cingulate.
This was a fantastic advance because it was the first time one had a really good biological marker. And Jeff is going to show us things like this in schizophrenia as well. But this was the first time one had an anatomical defect, and we'll hear later on how you can now use this to follow the outcome of treatment.
Tell me about schizophrenia, the clinical syndrome of schizophrenia.
Well, as Eric said, schizophrenia is an illness that involves positive symptoms like delusions and hallucinations. It may involve negative symptoms like apathy and withdrawal and cognitive impairment. And when I try to explain to other people what a psychotic episode is like, unlike mania, which is fun, a psychotic episode is horrible, it's terrible, it's an enormous pain. And I say it's like a waking nightmare with all the bizarre images and impossible things happening and the utter terror. Only with a nightmare, you kind of sit up in bed and you wake up and you can't just open your eyes and make psychosis go away. So that's what it feels like. For myself, I will have prominent, bizarre delusions, like I've killed hundreds of thousands of people with my thoughts. I have occasional hallucinations, a big spider walking up a wall, Santa Claus coming out of a TV. Who knows what that was about? And I also have disorganized thinking. So I had a breakdown on the roof of the Yale Law School my first semester there. And I said to my classmates, you know, are your legal cases being infiltrated? We have to case the joint. I don't believe in joints, but they do hold your body together. So loosely associated words that, when put together, don't really make sense. And that happens to me as well. I have been very fortunate that, except for the first 2 years of my illness, I have not had negative symptoms.
Now, are there phases for this?
You know, there are different sort of what are called course indicators. So some people might have one episode and be fine. Some people are chronically psychotic. Some people have episodes with inter-episode being okay, which is where I fit in. Mm-hmm. And on my own kind of course of my illness, I kind of divided into different phases. And in the first phase, the kind of prodromal phase where things started going wrong, I had my first kind of florid psychotic episode. I started walking home from school in the middle of the day and felt like the houses were communicating with me. They were sending messages, you know, you are special, you are especially bad, look, see, you must find. It was very scary. When I got to Oxford, I kind of officially broke down. And that's the second period. It started out looking like depression with mild paranoid features, but over time developed into more of a thought disorder than a mood disorder. And I was hospitalized the first year for a month, the second year for 4 months. By the second hospitalization, I was having really frank psychotic thoughts, like beings in the sky were putting thoughts in my head, commanding me to do things like walk in the hospital tunnels underneath the hospital and hurt myself and things like that. Eventually they sent me to a psychoanalyst, which I think was a prescient idea that it would help me because it's been enormously helpful. And during that phase, I was not on medication. Two things happened. My psychotic symptoms got worse. The positive symptoms got worse. So I was like living in the land of psychosis maybe 80% of the time.
You mean this was during the analysis it got worse?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the negative symptoms got better. I started being able to relate to people again and work again. And my own theory is, through the mechanism of getting connected with the therapist, I started getting connected with other people too. Then I had a big breakdown in New Haven, got into analysis with another analyst, and got on medication and had a big 10-year struggle with whether I needed medication. For me, my motto was the less medicine, the less defective. And the way I could prove I wasn't really ill was by getting off medication. So I undertook each effort with great gusto and failed miserably. Yeah. Eventually, I went to Los Angeles. I got a really great teaching job. And my analysts started saying, you know, you should just stay on the medication and get on with your life. And eventually, I tried that. And this is the fourth phase. Got in a great medication, first Zyprexa, then clozapine. My symptoms haven't gone away completely. My husband says psychosis is like an off-on switch, and not like an off-on switch, but like a dimmer. So at the far end, I'll have a transient thought like I've killed people, which I immediately dismissed. Further along the continuum, I might spend 2 or 3 days in the land of psychosis. And at the very far end, I would be crouching in a corner shaking for 2 weeks. That hasn't happened in a decade.
In a decade. You wrote a book called The Center Can't Hold.
Yes, The Center Cannot Hold.
Marvelous book.
Was it hard to come forward and be public about this?
Yeah, I had a lot of people who recommended that I not do it, including a geriatric psychiatrist, an emeritus professor at UCLA, who said, you know, do it under a pseudonym. And I just thought that would send the wrong message, that this is so awful that you can't say it out loud. Yeah.
The two of you are so articulate about your illness, which makes the whole thing so understandable to people. But you raise an issue that I would like both of you sort of to address, and that is you also made the point that you couldn't stand being on lithium, that you once, your therapist told you wanted you up the dose of lithium, and you said, if you like lithium so much, why don't you take some of it?
Well, this is not too long ago. He suggested that I might up my lithium a little bit, and I said, well, if you love it so much, why don't you take it? He said, you know, Kay, I've been treating you for decades. You haven't changed a bit. No, I think it is a perennial struggle. I mean, it's not a struggle for me anymore because I nearly died, and I don't struggle. But I mean, at the beginning, I think for most people, the idea of either defining yourself,
disease.
Plus there's bad side effects.
Yeah,
you
sure.
know, I mean, the side effects that are very impairing in your work and your personal life.
But I actually think what you point to, the sort of quote, what we call the narcissistic injury of having an illness and needing medication, is really hard to come to terms with. What I say is, I used to say, I don't want to use a crutch. Now I say, if my leg were broken, of course I'd use a crutch. Shouldn't I treat my neurotransmitters at least as kindly? Yeah. So I've totally changed in how I think about it.
Steve Warren, what about the genetic underlying of this and the heredity?
So we know genetics plays a role by looking at family histories. So something like schizophrenia occurs about 1% in the normal population, but if you have a sibling with schizophrenia, then your risk goes up to about 9%. Even more striking is if you look at identical twins. They share 100% of their genome, and the risk now is nearly 50%. What's important is it's not 100% like it is with a simple genetic trait like cystic fibrosis, where identical twins, both twins, would always have the same disorder. Here, half are discordant or don't share that disease. That says then that there's other factors playing a role, like environmental factors. You can see that also looking at non-identical twins, who are essentially just siblings, but yet they have a higher risk than normal siblings because they share more of an environment. So we think of complex disease as now having contributions of the genome as well as contributions of the environment. Usually it's easier finding the genetic factors first and then trying to sort out the environment.
Even though there are a lot of genes involved here.
Well, that's the other problem, is we know that it's not one gene. We don't know quite how many genes, but it's probably a handful of genes. But what we're learning in the last several years is that the brain, unlike many other organs, presents an enormous, what we call a mutational target. There's so many proteins that contribute to how the brain works that if you disrupt any one of them, you might have a similar outcome. And so the different genes might all lead to the same phenotype, so it gets to be a kind of a hard thing to narrow down. But it's complicated. But I think now with the new technologies that have been emerged in the last couple of years, being able to sequence genomes rather cheaply, and other technologies, at least gives us optimism that we'll be able to identify these genes in the future.
Jeff, take us to the biology of schizophrenia.
Well, Charlie, Ellen gave a beautiful description of the mental state of schizophrenia, and Steve has just told us that genes contribute to the risk to develop it. So what it means is that the seeds for the illness schizophrenia are really sown during early development, in gestation of the fetus and the developing brain, and it affects the way, not all cells in the brain, but a select group of neural circuits, the same kind of circuits that exist in the computer chips or in stereo equipment, come together and function. Now, the genes confer a certain degree of risk, which environment can either increase or can maybe reduce. So famine or nutritional deficits during exposing the fetus during pregnancy may have this effect. Exposure of the fetus to an infection, like during influenza epidemics, or toxic exposure if the mother does drugs or happens to have some type of toxic exposure, can amplify this risk. But then, during childhood, this vulnerability is pretty much dormant. And in individuals who are vulnerable to schizophrenia, these neural circuits during adolescence, during young adulthood, can begin to become dysfunctional. It occurs oftentimes in the context of stress, like when Ellen was in school, taking final exams, going to college, experiencing recreational drugs, maybe being drafted and going into the military. These stresses cause a dysfunction of these neural circuits, which result in the dysregulation of the chemicals that Helen was referring to, but in this case involving dopamine.
Right.
And this dopaminergic stimulation becomes excessive and leads to the psychotic symptoms that Ellen was experiencing, the hallucinations, the delusions in the brain. Now, the neural circuits involving dopamine really have three different pathways. One projects from the brainstem into the temporal lobe, and this leads to the psychosis, the psychotic symptoms. Another leads from the brainstem into the frontal cortex, and this affects cognitive functioning. And then a third projects to the striatum, and this affects motivation and interest in things. So these three different pathways, when the dopamine becomes dysregulated under stress during the late adolescence, early adulthood in life, lead to different clinical manifestations which come together to form the illness that Kreplin diagnosed. Now, right then, treatment can stabilize the illness, but all too often, people don't come to treatment till after it's they've been sick for many years, and or they stop their medicine and they get sick again. And when this happens, and you have repeated insults to the brain, this dysregulated functioning of these neural circuits secreting dopamine, this leads to a progression. And the progression, like somebody who has multiple little strokes, can lead to some decline in which people are not able to recover to the same level. And if you actually take brain scans, over time you can see the subtle but perceptible loss of brain gray matter, which is reflecting the elimination of these synaptic connections.
Tell me about, Kay, because you've experienced this grief and depression.
I got very interested in grief and depression just because I had both. I mean, I certainly had a lot of personal familiarity with depression and clinical. But my husband died about 7 or 8 years ago. Yes. And I was struck then by the differences between grief and depression, even though they often get put together in the same category. That grief is something that all of us will experience, have already experienced, will experience. And depression is something that a lot of people will, but not everyone. And the question is, why do they exist and how are they different? And so I struggled with that in a book to try and sort those things out. And one of the things that's most striking about grief is that when you grieve, you feel alive, even though you may be desperately sad and unhappy and missing and mourning. You feel alive. You don't feel unconnected with the world. And in fact, you can rather easily reconnect with the world if friends come in or you go out on engagements. And in fact, grief comes and goes in very much waves when you least expect it. But it's not an unremitting state, and you don't die inside. Whereas with depression is a deadened state that's unremitting, that doesn't respond to the world around you, to the environment. You could be told the best thing in the world, the worst thing in the world, and it doesn't have that much of an impact. It's an internal state. And one of the concerns that I have, along with a lot of my colleagues, of course, is that you don't want to medicalize the human condition. You don't want to start putting people in psychotherapy or giving them medications because they're grieving. I mean, it's the human condition, and it's part of what we learn, you move on from, you learn about mortality.
So the challenge is to make sure you distinguish between the two?
That's right.
Yes, and that you recognize when people have, actually the real challenge is to recognize when people have both, so that you can treat the depression without people having to go through additional horrendous pain. You can treat that which is treatable and then leave to nature that which is nature's.
She wrote a marvelous book called Nothing Was the Same when Richard White, several years later that she wrote this. First of all, Richard White, her husband, was a fantastic guy, a major psychiatrist, and the two of them had a great influence on each other's lives, which she described very beautifully. It's actually sort of a love story, the book. And she just expresses so beautifully the difference between this grief that, it comes and goes. So it's not all the time. You can be moments of joy that you can experience, but you can't when you have the depression.
It's quite interesting because you can actually study intense personal sadness and map it and get a signature of that. Yeah. And you can actually do that same thing in people who are depressed and actually look at the difference between being depressed and situationally sad. And there are areas of the brain that are different. And what just struck me, it kind of was a light bulb moment for me right now from some of our own data, that the part that differs is an area of the frontal cortex that is responsible for the self-connectedness. And in depressed people, when they're currently depressed and they get sad, that area of the brain doesn't come on as it does in healthy people who are experiencing a past episode, recollecting a sad event.
If you look at how society responds to you if you're depressed, as opposed to when you're grieving, everyone can reach out to you, or almost everyone, unless they're complete creeps. I mean, but for the most part, people really will reach out to you if they know you have undergone a loss like a death. And they will do so. And those rituals will work for a while. They're not totally, but they will work. And society has evolved ways through religion and friendships and so forth to do that. In depression, people avoid you because it is first of all, depression is contagious. The mood is contagious. And secondly, they have a real sense that they can't connect. They cannot make a connection with you. You cannot make a connection with them.
One of the interesting things that emerges with both of you is that you had treatment fairly early in your disease, that was a very interesting combination of treatments and very effective in both of your cases. I wonder whether you could say something about that.
I mean, Ellen and I have talked about this a lot. I mean, I'm a huge admirer of everything she's done and her writing. And one of the things that we've talked about is it's not just medication. I mean, I'm completely beholden to medication. I would be dead as a dead duck without it. I don't have any question about that, and I believe in it scientifically, personally, whatever. But psychotherapy has been life-saving. And we both have been fortunate, and certainly I speak for myself, to have tremendously good psychiatrists who did not make the distinction between psychopharmacology and putting it over here and psychotherapy over here. He did both, and he did it both with ease and grace and tremendous skill, knew an enormous amount about the illness and an enormous amount about the human condition and human nature, and it's just tremendously important.
What is so beautiful about this is one tended to think of psychotherapy and drugs as working in very different ways. One is talk therapy, and the other is biological. And now it's clear that from Helen's studies and other people's studies that psychotherapy works on the brain. It's a biological treatment. When you and
okay, so the psychotherapy produces a biological change
in the brain. It's like a biological treatment. When you and I are having a conversation, it changes our brain. It's a biological interaction.
As I say, the important thing to keep in mind is when you're talking about mood disorders, bipolar disorder, depression, and schizophrenia, we're talking about a pathologic condition that medication helps to restore the neurochemical balance, but that in addition, the value of psychotherapy, and I'm going to say something that's a little bit provocative, but that it's the therapy, but it's also fundamentally the consistent, the supportive, and the healthy relationship that the individual giving the psychotherapy provides. These are the key ingredients to basically turning around mental illness and making people be able to achieve what Kay and Ellen have, as opposed to leaving a life of despair and inability to be productive.
Go ahead.
I was given a grave prognosis. I mean, I was expected to be unable to live independently, let alone to work. And I think if I just had medication, that would have happened. If I had just had psychotherapy, that would have happened. But together, they worked really well. A lot of people think that psychodynamic therapy isn't optimal for people with schizophrenia, but I think it really helps some, including me.
I think we've appreciated for some time, certainly in Jeff's department, that psychotherapy and drugs go together. Ellen's case is very unusual in the sense there are very few people with schizophrenia who avail themselves of psychoanalysis. So this is really very rare. And you actually described very nicely in your book and some of your talks that insight actually helped you.
There are a bunch of things I think help, if I might run through them. So I think, first of all, stress is bad for all illnesses, in particular mental illness, and psychotherapy helps you identify and cope with or avoid stressors. Second, it helps you develop more psychological mindedness and a stronger observing ego, so you can kind of take a step back and observe what's going on in your mind. Third, and I think this is really important, it helps you come to terms with the blow to your self-esteem of having a mental illness and being able to accept it. It's a place where you can bring your chaotic, scary, and destructive thoughts, so you don't have to say them out loud.
That's what therapy is about. That's beautifully said.
And as Eric was saying...
And know you're not alone.
That's right.
The reality also is that our current reimbursement systems, how we pay for mental health care, does not support what you're hearing is optimal treatment.
We have been fortunate in being able to pay.
They have the resources to do this.
And it's the standard of care by anybody's study of the studies. I mean, that psychotherapy and medication is better than either one alone. But the reimbursement system is such...
When we talk about reimbursement system, we talking about insurance companies are not recognizing this?
Insurance, Medicaid, and Medicare.
No. Absolutely.
Yes.
Medicare's too.
Now
does not. Kay and Ellen had the resources and the families and the intelligence to know how to seek the best treatment, but standard payment for health care, if it's not out of pocket, does not pay for these services.
Despite the fact
what's their rationale? What do they say is the reason?
It's
cost containment.
It's cost containment, although it's short-sighted in the sense that one of the other major reasons for psychotherapy's effectiveness is that it doesn't do you any good to have effective medications if people don't take them. And the major clinical problem in treating bipolar illness is not that we don't have medication, it's that people won't take them.
Schizophrenia as well. People don't like to be on drugs.
That's right, and for a lot of reasons, good and bad. And so that psychotherapy helps with that. So
it helps enormously.
Psychotherapy helps keep you on your drugs.
Yeah,
The physician makes sure that you take it. But I think there's another point. There is, this is not an area I'm expert in, Jeff, so correct me if I'm wrong. There is a bias toward mental illness that still persists to a certain degree, and this is really reflected in the reimbursement.
Yes.
But things have gotten better with the parity bill. I mean, USC, which is covered by federal law because we're self-insured, is really very generous now with mental health care, and I'm getting quite a bit of my psychoanalysis paid for, so it's better for many people.
It's important to recognize that our social policies are really self-defeating because although healthcare expenditures are a huge concern to the economy, we don't support the services that we know will reduce the morbidity and illness and cost to society.
It's an enormous financial burden, mental illness.
tragedy.
And I think one of the reasons this is such a historic occasion to see people with serious illnesses who, when appropriately treated, have a fantastic life and contribute importantly to society.
But this is not, they are not the typical face of people that you think of for mental illness. You think of the psychotic killer or the deranged individual, not productive individuals who have successful careers.
Under what circumstances do psychotherapy and medication fail?
Is the fact that it's very clear that despite the fact that there are many, many medications that can work in individuals and a number of evidence-based psychotherapies, some people don't get better with any combination of anything that we've got. The good news is that the best treatment for depression that we've had for a very long time is electroconvulsive therapy, and that can get people out of an episode of depression where they may be suicidal and moribund. On the other hand, the more medications you've failed, the less likely that ECT will keep you well, and it has side effects. So we're in a situation that we have people that are suffering in the way we've heard described, that there is nothing that we can do, and it's a malignant situation.
But you went beyond this.
Well, we took a different tact. We said, look, we're identifying a circuit in the brain that seems to go wrong with people when they're depressed. We see that we can correct the circuit function with medication. We can correct the circuit function with cognitive therapy. We can even see its correction with placebo when people recover. And we started to isolate that certain changes needed to happen or you didn't get well. And what we did is we were in the right place at the right time. The work by the neurologists and the neurosurgeons on Parkinson's disease, recognizing that when people stop responding to the medications for Parkinson's disease, that by knowing the circuits of Parkinson's disease, they could target in the circuit directly with focused brain stimulation, called deep brain stimulation, where an electrode is placed precisely in the brain by a skilled neurosurgeon, and that you could literally tune the abnormal circuit exactly where you knew it was dysfunctional. So we had a hypothesis that we knew the circuit for depression, and that we would go directly at the subcallosal cingulate and say, we want this area to turn down, and we want everything that talks to that brain region to be affected. And we literally implanted, and in people who basically everyone had given up on, we targeted that area, turned the electricity on, and saw some incredible things in the operating room, but more importantly, turned down this region, area 25, the subcallosal cingulate, and actually had these people recover who had been in this purgatory.
It's an immediate clearing of the mind.
Immediate.
Well, it's to make this point is recovery from depression takes time. This is very important to take away from this. But in the operating room, it's like we were watching the depression
waking up.
It was not that they had an immediate antidepressant effect, but the psychic pain, they felt differently, that something about the illness had been fundamentally changed by that acute stimulation, but it required continuous stimulation over time to actually maintain the effect. Because if you turn it off over several weeks with stress, you will go back to the state you were in. But it tested the idea that you could tune the circuit directly with electricity.
Does this work in Schizophrenia, does it have possibilities in schizophrenia?
It absolutely has possibilities. I mean, psychiatry utilizes 3 modalities of treatment. It's talk therapies, medication, and brain stimulation therapy. The most common form of brain stimulation historically was shock therapy, which suffered from a bad reputation, which is very undeserved because it's highly effective if safely administered. Helen has pioneered a technique developed for Parkinson's disease where you have a single lesion, a specific anatomic focus that you can say this is where the pathology is, and you then attack it with an electrode. In schizophrenia, we have 3 different circuits that are dysfunctional. So we have to decide exactly where the electrode should go, and we're not quite there yet.
The work that you've done in our understanding of depression makes one think that you don't have loss of synapses and loss of nerve cells, because there are periods in which people can really function very well. With schizophrenia, if the disease persists for some time, there is very good evidence from Jeff's work, from other people's work, you lose synaptic connections. What is critical in schizophrenia is what Ellen benefited from. Early intervention. Well, it's true for all psychiatric illnesses. The earlier you can diagnose it. And one thing that happens is that people who have the disease, the patients, like to deceive themselves, as both of you did.
Way too
and
long.
the families like to deceive themselves. So what one needs to do is remove the stigmata. I mean, if you had chest pain, your parents would not say, well, let's wait a few days and see what this is about.
Right,
They would take you immediately.
Or it's just a phase.
Right,
Just a
right.
phase.
Steve, what do you think about all this?
Well, I mean, that's what I think. What Eric just said is important from the genetic contribution. Is what we'd like to do is be able to identify the genes that would predispose an individual to these disorders prior to onset, so then they can be perhaps more responsive to therapeutics and prevent the onset of the
And
symptoms.
how are we doing on that?
Well, we're coming along. I mean, I think the idea is to identify a few genes that play a big role, and that gives us a toehold into the biochemistry of what's going on in the brain. It's just like Helen said, I mean, there's a lot of circuits and pathways where the genes are contributing. So it's a highway with every gene is the stoplight or the stop sign. And each individual gene can be changed, but it has the same effect on how the traffic flows. And that's part of the difficulty in identifying these genes, is it's so complex. If you just look at the synapse alone, there are
Hundreds of
and
molecules.
hundreds of proteins that interact.
So in everything we're talking about here in terms of depression and disorder and schizophrenia, we're all talking about treatment so far. Where is cure?
Cure is really not immediately on the horizon, but the illnesses, if they're identified promptly and treated effectively, can be stopped in their tracks. So we're talking about remission, which is within our grasp. If we simply get our act in order. In terms of cure will depend on the identification of the genes and on the ability to preempt the illness prior to the onset.
Prevention, yeah.
Absolutely.
Prevention
that's
is
the, but there's an important thing, Charlie, to realize, and that is many illnesses are like this. There is no cure for diabetes. It's a lifelong illness.
Hypertension.
There is no cure for hypertension. There are dozens of diseases that you can name. In fact, most of the common diseases, it's a question of good therapy and then maintaining that therapy with watchful waiting. And we see 2 spectacularly rich lives here of people who still suffer from the disease, but it's under very good control. So I think one has to come to grips with the fact that for a long time we will not be able to have cures, but that doesn't mean one doesn't have essentially effective cures. That is, people living with the disease, struggling periodically, but most of the time being able to lead a rich life.
I want to make one point also, that I think with Kay and me, it's not just that we're successful occupationally, but we have rich friendships.
Yes.
I have a husband who's amazing. You have a fiance who's amazing.
One final point I think it's worth emphasizing in this discussion is these are terribly complicated illnesses. This is much more complicated than hypertension or diabetes. These are probably the most complicated illness in all of medicine.
Because?
Because it involves the brain, and not just the brain the way it is involved in Parkinson's disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. It involves the highest, most complex functions of the brain.
What is the question you most want the answer to?
Well, personally, I want the answer to how it is that depression is mediated in the brain. What really is the source of the abnormality? We know that gene, environment, chemistry, circuits, but we're not really getting at the fundamental source of what makes negative mood progress into a state of absolute other suffering where you can't hold on to anyone else to pull you out of the pit. So that's the driving force for me.
You've heard me ask this before.
Yeah. Well, the same answer too, probably. It's you know, to go from a gene to behavior and understand all the steps in between is just would be fantastic. Particularly something as complex as a psychiatric disease.
And how far away are we from that?
A long way to get there.
I think the question that I would prioritize is not so much a scientific one as a social one. How can we eliminate stigma? I think the greatest barrier to making gains, both at a research level as well as a treatment level, is making society accept mental illnesses, genuine illnesses that require equal treatment to other medical illnesses.
I've always been interested in the overlap and distinctions between normal mood states and cognitive states, intellectual states, temperament, and pathology. Because in mood disorders, there are very interesting similarities and dissimilarities between, in terms of what's the difference between somebody who is very high voltage, enthusiastic, exuberant, high fire, high energy person, and someone who goes on to get just the next step over in terms of not manic, but but enough that it's getting disconcerting and out of control. And why do these things exist? And what is it about human temperament that is so adaptive about having so many wide varieties of temperament that a certain number of them that fail or get problematic? I guess trying to keep these conditions within the human condition in some sense of trying to understand them.
I mean, the easy answer is I'd like to find the cause and cure of schizophrenia, but that's a long-term project, and sort of more doable things are three. One, studying which psychosocial interventions are helpful for which people with schizophrenia and bipolar illness. Some may benefit from cognitive behavioral, some from psychodynamic. You don't have the equivalent of a drug company funding these studies, so it's harder to do them, and it's harder to do them for lots of reasons, but that's one thing. Second, I would like to try to find out ways to use less force with psychiatric patients. I was really traumatized by being in long-term restraints, you know, anywhere from 5 to 20 hours a day for several weeks. It's very, very painful, caused a lot of nightmares.
Tying you down? What does that mean, tying you down?
At 4 to 6 points for a 6-point reset range. And then the third thing is the stigma point, understanding why and how to combat it. And then the final thing is not so much something we should know, but something we should do, which is provide the resources so that we step up to the plate and give people the abilities to lead full and productive lives.
What a remarkable panel. What a remarkable story. You know. So looking ahead to episode 10.
In this program, we've discussed psychiatric illnesses. In the next program, we're going to consider neurological illnesses. And there's been spectacular progress in treating certain kinds of neurological illness. Parkinson's disease, even stroke, completely new ways of thinking about strokes. Moreover, we'll have a chance to discuss what is the difference between psychiatric disorders and neurological disorders. These are both brain disorders. But one of the interesting things is that even though there's some overlap, one feature about psychiatric disorders is they often reflect extensions of normal behavior. So depression is an extension of sadness that you and I feel when we're disappointed. Mania is an extension of the euphoria we feel after a very good program. And even schizophrenia, the delusions and hallucinations one occasionally has in dreams, in nightmares. So a lot of psychiatric symptomatology are extensions of the normal. This is one of the things Freud emphasized. Neurological diseases fragment behavior and often bring out completely surprising features of behavior. For example, there is, with certain kinds of strokes, a symptom of neglect, in which a patient will completely ignore an arm or a leg that they have because it's paralyzed. And they will sometimes push it out of bed saying, this does not belong to me. So we will not only learn about the localization of function, but we will see how abnormal functions appear and normal functions is fragmented in this wonderful episode coming up.
Episode 10 next month. See you then.
you.